A very good afternoon, everyone who's present here. I have the privilege of actually addressing the the last talk of this entire event. So before I say anything else, this has been one of the most transformative experiences that I've had. Being a trans person, I think this is the first space that I have truly felt comfortable that this is a trans led space. This is a space where trans people hold the cards, be the people who are able to talk, and that actually gives me the privilege of being able to talk at a very honest level. So I have just to introduce myself, I lead the LGBTQ inclusion at the Tata Group. I started with Tata Steel. That's where I work. My primary job is of a digital strategist. I am chosen as one of the fast track careers. I report directly to the chief information officer, and someday they see me as being the chief information officer, which is at a CXO level. So that is what I am. But coming from there, I want to talk about what does it really mean to have a trans person really integrated into a workspace. Also, what it means is, again, the last speaker advantages is that I get to speak about the futures, like what kind of future are we looking at. um, just a little bit of disclaimer, my talk in a lot of places would be aspirational, would be a little geared towards the respectable middle class corporate private working person, and that is an aspiration for a lot of people in the trans community as well as in all communities. So speaking from that point of view, I could have, there is going to be a little bit of, say, criticism of my own employers, and also a little bit of criticism of, say, the queer movement in general from the place that I stand. So my apologies already before I start. The topic that I am speaking on is nurturing tomorrows and how growth and leadership of trans person at workplaces is essential for the future. Uh, Before I begin, let us first talk about why. Why do we need trans people? Why do we need queer people at the workplace, right? And I'm talking from the perspective that is both workplaces centric as well as trans people centric. I have this line that I say all the time is that we live in very queer times. I mean, you're all wearing masks. You know what is happening in the world. We're living in very queer times, and at queer times, we need queer leaders. Let me use a word that is something that if you're doing an MBA, you would have heard of. That we live in a VUCA world. VUCA meaning, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. A lot of corporates are right now first time engaging with a world like this, and they have to lead their people through this kind of turbulence that is there. But we as trans people, we as queer people, for us, our lives have been VUCA. We've had volatility, we have uncertainty, we live in the complexity of our identities, we have a complete ambiguity of where we fit into the different structures that are already created. And we have found a way of coping with that, leading with that, finding our space within that, because we are we have this high level of personal accountability. We know that most of our actions will be responsible, and we will be responsible for most of our actions, and they're going to affect us quite personally. Secondly, we are like, we know about empathy. Leading with empathy, we create collectives, we create places where we can really build and co-create things together, as well as we have hyper almost anxiety or awareness of complexities that are going on. So if I'm a trans person, I know there is a difficult situation coming up, I'll be extremely aware of what I have to do, and take care. Like mostly, say, people say, if you're traveling as a trans person, you will be extremely aware and plan of every eventualities that goes on. So you are always in that worst case scenario thinking. And these things, these qualities really make queer people and really make trans people the people you need to have at the helm of the organization. I'm not talking within the organization. I'm not talking economic inclusion. I'm talking about, leading the organizations. Now, coming to that, I wanted to really impress on the kind of power that HR or human resources has in this point of time. There's actually this article that came out in Arts and Letters Daily, which talks about HR being the primary central organizing force behind our societies. Let me go a little bit into that. You see, and I'm borrowing a little bit from some discussions we had yesterday, is that we are a democracy of exceptions and the exceptional, right? So while the exceptional happens in the society, the felt reality and the lived reality of a large number of people or in the economic, who are part of the economic workforce are, they experience it through their HR. They experience it through the policies that are there in their workplaces. So for example, if there is a large scale movement like Me Too, Me Too is going to be something for movie stars and celebrities, and you'll hear a lot about, in the public discussion. But for a general person, where they're going to face it or where they're going to have any interactions with it is in their anti-harassment work policy, which is there at the workplace, right? Similarly, we had a very large push for, say, inclusion of, colored people with the whole Black Lives Matters movement, where you see a lot of companies now coming forward and trying to work for inclusion. And then again, this inclusion is going to be felt as how many people do these companies have from the colored workforce who are going to be, part of it and leading it. So that's the idea that I want to say, is that the exceptional is made mundane by HR, and that's where we experience our world. So the next part I want to come to is the pretty curious case of a trans person fully integrated into their workplace. We heard a lot of stories in which a lot of challenges were presented, that there were so many challenges of, just getting access to a workplace, just getting, the basic requirements of the workplace. In my experience, I've kind of had the privilege of, a lot of these policies, a lot of these changes, being able to shape these at my workplace. But the primary reason and the primary driver of it was my visibility. So the primary thing of a trans person at a workplace is visibility, hyper visibility. The whole changes that happened, say, in Tata Steel, which is a 100-year-old company, nothing would have happened. And we actually started, I'm trying to refrain from the first, but we actually started the first LGBTQ employee resource group in a manufacturing company in India. It was not even heard of before. We had one of the LGBTQ inclusive policies at a manufacturing workplace, which was again, a large part of the workplace did not believe in. But that's the thing, that these things were possible only because I was visible. And because I was visible and I was determined to stand my ground, I was transitioning at my workplace and trying to make sure, whatever needs that I have and whatever needs I can think of that queer people have are brought into policies, are formulated into the working of the organization. And I was, the way I was using it is that the companies, corporates, especially, say you are in Bangalore and this is a primarily corporate driven city, and that this is huge PR material, having trans people at your workplace, having, hiring trans people at your workplace, that is huge PR material. And that's what makes companies go for it. That's what makes them make half-baked ideas of, hiring trans people into their organization, having those numbers. So now, while this is done, I knew what the motivation behind it was, and I was consciously using it. To just give an example, I suddenly found myself in a numerous number of publications that were going on at the whole Tata website, the whole group websites, lot of conversations talking about my story, and my story becoming this sort of pioneering event that led a change and things like that. And I could understand why they were happening, and I was consciously using it. For example, one of the biggest examples that I cite in other say forums where it is primarily cishet, for cishet I talk about how my story was included at the Tata Experiential Center, which is 100-year-old building, the Bombay House. They created an experiential center of what Tata means to the country, what Tata means to everyone. So along with things like absolutely historical things like the first ingot of steel that was created in Asia, that was present there in that room. There were letters from Mahatma Gandhi written to J.N. Tata to start an Indian enterprise, and steel was looked at the enterprise that will build the future. This is like pre-independence and everything. So along with these things, these absolutely momentous things, there was my story of a pioneering event in which I transitioned at the workplace, made the workplace change a lot of things about it, made it a lot more inclusive, and the way we speak about things. So all of this was happening, everything was happening, and it was of course extremely emotional for me, but somewhere it was not satisfying. And that's where I'm coming to the next part, that trans people, due to their visibility, also carry the burden of being ideal employees. Like trans persons, because they are extremely visible, they have to be extremely ideal, they have to perform the best, they have to look, they have to, I would say, pass into the cishet ideas of what trans people should be like. So those things are there. And even say back home, back home meaning in my company, I was still, while I was being so visible and speaking in so many different forums, I think I've done forums all around India, incorporated. While I was doing all that, all this was looked at as a distraction from my first, my day job per se. So while that was there, I realized that hyper visibility without agency doesn't really give us anything, doesn't really make a trans person, able to thrive in a workplace, right? So even in the LGBTQ inclusion front, which I was supposed to be leading, there were my demands which I wanted. There were things which I thought were first priority, that is to have a preferred name policy. People can use preferred name for their communications and genders for their communications. Instead of that, what the company wanted to focus on is, Pride Month celebrations, wanted to focus on, giving equal benefits to same-sex partners as married couples. Knowing the queer community, I am not sure, like there are of course exceptions, Vihan, but apart from exceptions, I don't know how many queer people and trans people really fall into that area where they're going to be having partners equal to a married partner, unless of course the rules are already there, unless of course there is a law against it. Without that, I mean, I know people who change partners, so I wouldn't think that the sheer number of people who are going to say benefit from this policy is going to be extremely low, and I don't know anyone in my organization who has got it. So then I come to the real crux of the matter here, is that what are trans futures in an organization? What do we look at trans futures, and how do we build them? Now, the term trans joy is what we believe is essential to bring a silent revolution uh, of having trans people at the workplace. I think what really determines the success of an inclusion effort, and you might know that a lot of companies are on the diversity and inclusion bandwagon. Everyone wants to include people. But what really determines the success of inclusion effort is to have trans people, or basically marginalized groups, grow in the organization. organically grow in the organization and become leaders. Hiring is very simple. A lot of people hire very easily and at a position where they don't really see a future of the trans people that they're hiring. It's mostly done for the numbers, it is mostly done for the PR activity that it generates without looking at the future. So the real test is that when we are going to have trans people grow within the organizations, where they are going to be weathering the storms of, all this unconscious bias that exists, where they're weathering the storms of, qualifications and a largely cis-het dominated and, affirming institutions that we have. However, we are also at a very interesting point of, say, the trans inclusion at a workplace, because for the first time ever, and I would really gladly be contradicted at this point, is that for the first time ever we have this possibility of trans people having the option of choosing a career, having the option of choosing to be a leader at a private enterprise, at a highly economical enterprise. And this is something that actually is aspirational to the middle class, but also it's something that Tori Peters in her book Detransition Baby talks about as, the sex and the city generation of trans people, where trans people, trans women in this case, it is possible to have, the upwardly mobile stories that cis women have, where they can choose romance, where they can choose careers, where they can choose for themselves rather than, be at the mercy of what organizations give them. I'll come next to the part of, what is the advantages of trans inclusion. Like, we talked so much about trans inclusion, but why would corporates do that, and why would trans people want to be part of corporates? That's also a very important thing. Is that I personally believe, and I don't know if you would, but trans and marginalized people are the closest we can get to stargazers and future seers of the society. Because there are things, the needs that trans people have today are going to be felt by a lot of, cis-het people, or, whatever people in the future would have. For example, I'll give the example that it's a buzzword now in the tech industry, in all sorts of industry, to have privacy, right? But 5 years back, the social media companies were taking privacy for a toss. There was no privacy, and the primary reason why I believe that was their lookout was because they didn't have people like trans people who have always known about the value of privacy, known about how important privacy is to them. For example, in my own example, Facebook actually outed me to my colleagues before I was ready to, come out to them. I had a separate account on Facebook for my congruent to my gender identity, but because of things like people you may know, this was shown to some people in my workplace, and I was basically outed without ever ever getting the chance to say my own story. So these are the things, like privacy, for example, is one of those things in which trans people can go, make decisions. There's also another thing that happens is that there is a very big, you can say, accountability in organizations today to be on the right side of history, right? So, for example, I would take the example of something that happened very recently with Netflix, where a comedian called Dave Chappelle was extremely transphobic. There were trans people in Netflix who tried to, uh, report against it, tried to organize against it, but because they were not in a position of decision making, because they were not powerful enough, they were hardly able to make any difference. And that created that position in which being trans at Netflix now makes you an outlier, now makes you basically someone who's going to be having a lot of difficulty being proud of your organization, being proud to belong to your organization. So having trans people, having queer people or marginalized people in decision making positions is what I would say reduce the discontent with the content that you create. And I would say all companies today are content creating companies. I mean, Tata Steel, the way it is seen by everyone else is the content that it creates, including, say, the talk that I'm giving here. It is content that Tata Steel is creating and giving out to people. Right. So this is one of the things, and the third thing is that we are coming to the generation of Gen Z. Gen Z is going to be part of the workplaces now. Gen Z and even generations after that. And I believe that Gen Z is a generation of worktivists. They are going to be activists in all of the transactions and all the interactions that they do. So there is going to be a need to engage in social as well as environmental issues at an individual level. Every employee. Now you can't have just the leader or just the CEO talking about how socially inclusive or how environmentally inclusive an organization is, because every single person of the workforce is going to have an opinion and is going to try and make sure that these opinions are congruent to a progressive future. So looking at Gen Z in mind, it is important that we bring that progressiveness even before Gen Z has come in and come in earnest. So that's where we want trans people, that is where we want marginalized people to lead the initiatives to make sure, because we are, as I said, future seers. We see a lot of things which other people almost have to figure out through their experience. So that's one of the primary reasons why I believe trans people in decision making is the only alternative for the future. I'm not talking just for the sake of trans inclusion. I'm talking about for corporates to function. Now I'll come to how it is to be done. I mean, there's so much to be done, but how do we do it? I'll not go into the specifics of the services that, say, companies believe trans people need. Now, of course, gender neutral washrooms, say coverage of whatever medical expenses trans people might have, and a lot of these basic things, basic services, having an option apart from male and female, these things are very, very basic, and I'll not go into that. I'll really go into that perspective in which organizations need to take trans inclusion with an outcome based policy and outcome based what do you say strategy, rather than point solutions. The point solution generally is that we don't have trans people in our organization, everyone else is hiring trans people, we need some trans people, right? But where is the outcome? And no company, very honestly, does anything without an outcome, without a business outcome that is going to be relevant for them for a very long period of time. Now, these trans people that you're hiring, unless they are going to be helpful for you at a very long period of time, it doesn't make sense to hire them. So that's why I meant that, instead of trying to get your foothold in the PR engine and have half-baked solutions for hiring, it is very important that we nurture them, nurture those tomorrows. Because if we don't do that, it is basically like planting a sapling in an unfertile land. You are going to put that sapling and they're going to either have stunted growth or they're going to die off. And that is not a story that media will cover. Media will cover when you hired them. Media won't cover when they dropped out or when they were frustrated within the organization. So the way to do that is something that I think Vihan was talking about, is to make sure that there is a constant feedback mechanism. Just after hiring, what a lot of organizations want to do is that, look, we've given you this, we've given you whatever we could have given. We could have given you gender neutral washrooms, we've given you these policies, look how beautiful our policies are. We've given you all of this, now you are equal to everyone else. And that's the story that they want to portray. That's the way they want to deal with this problem, is that just put the basics in place and then not care, then not have to care. but the implicit issues that trans people have within organizations because of their visibility, because of this implicit bias that exists. Like, you can of course say that there is a huge uh, bias against women already in the organization. Think about how it goes against trans people. Now, giving them the basics, giving their names, preferred gender, preferred names, that doesn't put away this implicit bias, right? So, no amount of, all these unconscious bias trainings and workshops that keep happening over corporates all over is going to address that. The only reason, only way that it can be addressed is through conscious bias, through making sure that if you are hiring trans people, you are going to know and you are going to check on how they're moving in the organization, how they're growing in the organization in a constant feedback loop. That if they are facing issues, even ones which they are not very proud to talk about, so creating that safe space where they can talk about the issues that they face, that they're probably falling down in their career, getting stagnant at some point of time. So all of these things are what need to be addressed first before we go into just purely hiring. Because and it also relates a little bit to the horizontal reservations demands that Grace and the other people were talking about, is because unless we have affirmative action, unless we have conscious bias of putting trans people first in a lot of positions, it is never going to be addressed. And I personally believe that organizations, companies, they already have a lot of bias. You have a Tamilian trying to get another Tamilian getting up in their organization. You have a Bengali who wants more Bengalis to prosper in their organization. So if all these, what is called in colleges as phylum, if all these exist, what is wrong with knowing and having a conscious bias of including trans and queer people? So I come to the absolute last part of it. And another thing is that not look at it from a charity perspective, which is where a lot of the companies now look at it. I'll come to the last part, which is we talked about all that companies can do, but what about trans responsibility, right? So trans people have to learn to take up space as they deserve and not budge from our demands for taking up spaces in leadership as well as responsibility and commitment, because these are things that are valued in organizations. And chiefly, again, in this decision making and co-creation. The mentality that I really want to change is that we hear this a lot, that organizations are them and they are doing things to us, and they are not, they're being gatekeepers of us availing services, of availing who we are. I would like to change that to a position of us, because as more trans people get into the workplace, the idea that the mentality they have to have is that it is us now who are going to make the decisions, and we are going to be responsible to make the future of this company, regardless of the I would say the resistances that we face. We are going to face resistance every step of the way. But if we really truly go to that point where we belong and where we feel that this is ours, that is when we can really affect change. And that is also one of the reasons of how we are going to nurture tomorrow, is to have more people, have trans people at the workplace, have trans people at the leadership space, and they will be able to understand the needs of the next generation of trans people. I'd like to just end with an example of, say, trans joy at the workplace, which kind of doesn't get talked about a lot, or something like that. We always talk about, how cishet people get to enjoy, share their details of their marriages, their weddings, their children, when they have a children. I in order to do, in order to change mindsets a little bit, what I did is that when I got my legal documents changed, I got a huge box of sweets. I took it to my entire floor and I distributed with them, because this for me was a time of great joy. It was for me one of the things that I wanted to celebrate. And if the cishet people do not know what we are trying to celebrate and what makes us happy, it'll never, we're never going to be equal. We are always going to be the other. So it is getting into that part where we are equal, where we can express our desires, our need for joy, our need for visibility, as well as our need for agency. So that's all I have to